It sounds at first like a trivial question. Men are being shelled. Men are dying in the mud. The world as they knew it has been replaced by a landscape of craters and wire, and the particular silence that follows an artillery barrage when the ringing in your ears hasn't quite stopped yet, and you're not certain whether you're alive or whether being alive is simply what dying feels like for the first few seconds. And in the middle of all of this, someone is asking about shaving. It sounds trivial until you understand what shaving actually meant in that environment, what it represented, what it cost to do it, and what it cost not to do it. Then it stops being trivial entirely and becomes one of the more revealing windows into what sustained men through the conditions of trench warfare, and why the American military's insistence on shaving under almost any circumstances was not the bureaucratic absurdity it might appear to be from a comfortable distance. The First World War trench was one of the most hostile environments for personal hygiene that human beings have ever been required to inhabit for extended periods. The mud was not the mud of a garden or a farm field after rain. It was a substance created by months and years of constant bombardment that had broken down the soil structure of the Belgian and French countryside into something closer to paste, a mixture of earth and water and decomposed organic material that clung to everything, penetrated everything, and resisted every effort to remove it with a tenacity that men who lived in it described as almost malevolent. Water was everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in the sense that the trenches flooded regularly and men lived with wet feet for days or weeks at a time. Nowhere in the sense that clean water for drinking, let alone for washing and shaving, was a logistical achievement rather than an ambient resource. American soldiers arrived on the Western Front in significant numbers beginning in 1917, and they arrived with a set of expectations about military appearance that the existing Allied forces, after 3 years of industrial warfare, had largely abandoned in the face of circumstances. French and British troops who watched the fresh American doughboys go through their morning shaving routines in forward positions looked on with an expression that mixed amusement with something approaching respect for what those men were willing to attempt. The Americans shaved because they had been told to shave. They had been told to shave because the United States Army, which had adopted a clean-shaven standard as its official policy in the years before the war, had decided that the standard applied in France as much as it applied in training camps in Georgia and Texas. The reasoning behind that policy was not purely aesthetic, though the aesthetic dimension was real and not unimportant. The practical argument for shaving in a trench environment was directly related to the gas mask, a piece of equipment that had become essential to survival on the Western Front after the introduction of chemical warfare in 1915. A gas mask forms its seal against the face, and that seal is what stands between the wearer and whatever mixture of chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, or other chemical agents the enemy has introduced into the atmosphere. A beard, even a few days of stubble, breaks that seal in ways that allow gas to reach the skin and the respiratory system. A soldier who hadn't shaved could survive a gas attack if his mask happened to sit well against his particular face structure and his particular growth pattern. Or he couldn't. The gas didn't give you time to find out which case applied to you. The shaving requirement was, at its core, a survival policy expressed as a grooming standard. But there was more to it than the gas mask argument. Important as that argument was, the American military's insistence on maintaining grooming standards under field conditions reflected a philosophy about the relationship between external order and internal state that had deep roots in military thinking, and that the experience of the First World War tested severely and ultimately validated. The philosophy held that men who maintained the disciplines of normal civilized life, who shaved and cleaned their equipment and stood their posts with proper bearing, were men who had not been entirely consumed by the chaos and degradation of their environment. That the act of shaving in a muddy trench was, in a real sense, an assertion that the man doing it was still himself, still a human being with standards and routines, not simply an organism trying to survive in an overwhelming environment. The mechanics of shaving in a trench were a study in improvisation and adaptation that told you a great deal about the character of the men performing it. The equipment available to the average American soldier for personal grooming in the field was limited but carefully chosen. The safety razor had become the dominant shaving technology by the time of the First World War. replacing the straight razor that had required skilled handling and regular professional attention to maintain. The Gillette Safety Razor, whose inventor had successfully lobbied to have his product included in American military kit, was compact, reasonably durable, and required only replacement blades rather than the honing and stropping that a straight razor demanded. It was not perfectly suited to field conditions, but it was considerably better suited to them than any alternative then available. Water was the first challenge. A man who wanted to shave needed water, and in an ideal world that water would be warm, which both made the shave more comfortable and softened the beard in ways that reduced the effort and the risk of cutting the skin. In a trench, warm water was a luxury that required specific effort to obtain. Small portable stoves, when they were available and when fuel could be sourced, could heat a mess tin of water to something approaching useful temperature. More commonly, soldiers used whatever water was available, which in winter meant water that was near freezing, which meant that the experience of shaving was substantially more uncomfortable than the civilian version and substantially more likely to result in nicks and cuts that, in an environment where infection was an ever-present danger, were more than minor inconveniences. The shaving soap or cream available to American soldiers in the First World War era was generally issued in solid cake or stick form, which traveled better than the cream in tubes that would come later, and that resisted the freezing temperatures of winter better than liquid formulations. Soldiers learned to work the soap into a lather using whatever water was available and whatever container was at hand, cupping the lather in a palm if nothing better was available, and applying it by hand when a brush had been lost or broken. The brush was preferred because it distributed the soap more evenly and helped lift the beard for a closer shave, but the brush was also another item that could be lost, could freeze, could become so saturated with mud that it transferred more dirt than soap. Soldiers adapted. Mirrors were another problem. A shave requires you to see what you're doing, and a trench did not come furnished with bathroom mirrors. Small personal mirrors, the size of a playing card or smaller, were carried by many soldiers as part of their personal kit, and these served double duty as shaving aids and as signaling devices that could reflect light to communicate with other positions. In the absence of a personal mirror, soldiers made do with whatever reflective surface was available. A bayonet blade held at the right angle, the bottom of a tin canteen, the surface of still water in a shell crater or a section of flooded trench. The image produced by these improvised mirrors was not ideal, but it was enough to work with, and soldiers who had been shaving under field conditions for weeks developed a feel for the process that reduced their dependence on visual feedback. The timing of shaving in a trench was determined by the tactical situation, which in practice meant that men shaved when there was a pause in activity that offered a few minutes of relative safety and relative quiet. The morning stand-to, in which all men manned their positions at dawn to guard against the attack that both sides knew was most likely in the early light, was followed by a period of relative quietude during which morning routines could be accomplished. Breakfast was distributed, weapons were cleaned, and men shaved or attempted to shave before the day's duties began. This morning routine had a regularity and a normalcy to it that was, in the conditions of the trench, almost surreal in its ordinariness. Men who had been standing in a foot of water in the dark waiting for a German attack that didn't come would dry their hands, produce a razor and a piece of soap, and methodically remove the growth that had accumulated since the previous morning, as if the intervening hours had been an ordinary night, rather than what they actually were. The challenge of shaving in winter conditions was severe enough that it became a specific topic in the correspondence home from American soldiers on the Western Front. Letters to families described the experience with the combination of complaint and dark humor that characterized American soldier writing about conditions that were difficult, but not immediately life-threatening. A soldier from Ohio writing home in January 1918 described shaving from a mess tin of water that had developed a skin of ice by the time he got to it, and noted that the cold had at least the advantage of numbing the face to the point where the razor's failures caused less pain than they otherwise would have. His sergeant, he added, had inspected his shave and found it acceptable, which was the standard that mattered regardless of what the process had involved. That sergeant's inspection was not incidental to the story. The enforcement of grooming standards in American trench units was a real and consistent feature of First World War military life. and the NCOs responsible for that enforcement were the mechanism through which the Army's policy became individual soldiers' daily practice. A sergeant who inspected his men's appearance each morning was doing several things simultaneously. He was enforcing a policy that had a genuine safety rationale related to gas mask fit. He was maintaining a practice that served the psychological function of asserting normalcy and discipline in an environment that was neither normal nor particularly conducive to discipline. And he was communicating to his men through the specific act of caring about their appearance in a place where appearance seemed to be among the least of their concerns. That standards existed here too, that the conditions of the trench had not suspended the basic requirements of being a soldier, and that meeting those requirements was expected regardless of how impossible meeting them might seem. The psychological dimension of maintaining grooming standards in the trenches has been discussed by military historians and military psychologists in ways that the soldiers themselves rarely made explicit, but that their behavior reflected. The concept that has been most consistently invoked is the relationship between external order and internal resilience. The idea that maintaining control over one's appearance when one has no control over one's situation is a way of preserving a sense of agency and identity that the environment of total war systematically attacks. A man who shaves in a trench is a man who has made a decision about who he is that the trench has not been permitted to make for him. He has asserted, in the most literal and mundane way possible, that he is still a person who shaves, still a person with routines and standards, still connected to the person he was before he climbed into this hole in the ground. Veterans of the First World War who were interviewed in the decades after the conflict returned to the subject of small personal rituals, with a frequency and a seriousness that suggested those rituals had mattered in ways that were difficult to articulate but easy to recognize. Men who had maintained their shaving routines throughout their service described it not as compliance with orders, but as a choice they had made to hold on to something. Men who had let the routine slip, who had gone days or weeks without shaving during particularly brutal stretches of combat, described the experience of resuming the habit afterward as a kind of reconnection, a reestablishment of themselves as people rather than simply as survivors. The razor, in that context, was a tool for something more than hair removal. The Second World War carried these lessons forward in a more systematized form, with the gas mask argument remaining central to official shaving policy, but the psychological and disciplinary dimensions becoming more explicitly acknowledged in military training and leadership doctrine. American soldiers shaving in the foxholes of Normandy, in the bombed ruins of Italian hill towns, in the mud of the Hurtgen forest and the snow of the Ardennes, were participating in a practice that had been tested in the trenches of the previous war and had come through that test validated. The equipment had improved razors, better soap formulations, compact mirrors designed specifically for field use. The underlying logic had not changed at all. The image of an American soldier shaving in a shell crater with an inch of water in his helmet is one of those images from military history that seems at first like an absurdity and reveals itself, on reflection, as something closer to a defiance. The shell crater exists because someone tried to kill him. The water in his helmet is barely enough for the purpose and is probably cold enough to be unpleasant and is certainly not clean by any standard a civilian would recognize. The razor may be dull. His hands may be shaking from cold or exhaustion or the specific tremor that sustained artillery exposure produces in the body. And he is shaving anyway because his sergeant told him to, because the gas mask requires it, because his unit does it, because he does it, because whatever else this war has taken from him, it has not yet taken the person who shaves in the morning, and he is not ready to give that up.